My name is Derek Prince, and you're listening to Soundtracked, a video game music podcast. And this is Any Special Orders? Nico's Shop theme from Devil May Cry 5. Devil May Cry 5 developer Capcom have been enjoying something of a renaissance as of late, and this is just one stellar track from a lineup of stellar games the developer has published within the last year or so. After an adventurous but ultimately misguided attempt at a reboot by outside developer Ninja Theory, Capcom let the Devil May Cry series sit on the back burner for a bit before resurrecting it earlier this year for a 5th installment in the mainline canon. Nico's shop theme was composed by Kota Suzuki and Yoshiya Terayama and sports a kind of cool under pressure swagger that permeates the rest of the game. Changing gears completely, our next game comes to us from the far distant past that was 1988. Kings of the Beach is a beach volleyball game originally released for the Commodore 64 and MS-DOS before finding its way to the NES. While the game was a more than serviceable attempt at recreating the full beach volleyball experience, it was the soundtrack that made the most of an impression on me. The soundtrack for Kings of the Beach was composed by Rob Hubbard and was just one of 95 soundtracks composed over his career, 89 of which were composed between 1985 and 1991. Wow. This is Match Theme from Kings of the Beach. Up next, we have a track from the endlessly stylish Persona series of JRPGs, specifically Persona 5. Longtime series composer Shoji Meguro was given free rein when it came to creating the soundtrack and took over 3 years to complete his work on the project. In interviews, Meguro would express the idea that the soundtrack for Persona 5 should be taken as a whole, instead of just songs sandwiched between opening and closing singles. Meguro leaned into strong acid jazz stylings for the score and was able to create something wholly listenable. Bluesy guitars noodle front and center as synth and strings trade blows. This is Days When My Mother Was There from Persona 5. How does one create a memorable soundtrack for a game that is trying its hardest to evoke a sense of loneliness and at times even dread? That is the question that was posed to Super Metroid composers Kenji Yamamoto and Minako Hamano. The move from the NES to the Super Nintendo gave the duo more than double the sound channels to work with and allowed them to more fully realize the layered and atmospheric soundscape they had had in mind since the original Metroid game. A punchy bass line stands front and center in this track, which is admittedly a bit of an odd duck compared to the rest of the soundtrack, which was tailor-made to give 6-year-old me nightmares. This is Brinstar Overgrown with Vegetation from Super Metroid. Thanks again for listening. My aim with this podcast is to introduce people to game music that can be enjoyable all on its own. I'd like it to be as good as it can be as the show progresses, and I thank you for sticking around. To close us out, we have a track from the brilliant 2017 Nintendo Switch 3D platformer Super Mario Odyssey. Series composer Koji Kondo lent a hand for the soundtrack, but it was the game's lead composer, Naoto Kubo, who did most of the heavy lifting. The game's soundtrack was as varied and eclectic as the kingdoms Mario visits on his journey. This track gives listeners a bit of the old bait and switch with a brief intro that gives way to surfy guitars on top of a restless breakbeat. Thanks for listening. I'm Derek Prince, and this is Steam Gardens from Super Mario Odyssey.